Welcome to the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast, presented by Bradford Literature Festival. In this episode, join Reza Aslan for an enlightening talk about the enduring legacy of Hussain ibn Ali, a figure who, while often seen as polarising within Islam, has the potential to be a unifying force for social justice and freedom of speech. Hussain ibn Ali, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, is a symbol of courage and resistance against oppression. As a defender of freedom of speech and a beacon for social justice, his legacy continues to inspire countless individuals around the world. Recorded live at the 2023 Bradford Literature Festival, delve into the lessons we can learn from Hussain's story and how his principles continue to inspire the fight against oppression in today's world.
Session is political activism of Hussain ibn Ali, lessons learned, lessons to be taught. My name is Professor Saeed Khan, coming to you from Detroit, Michigan, where I teach at Wayne State University in the disciplines of Near East and Asian Studies and Global Studies, and also serve as the director of the Center for the Study of Citizenship. There, now I can get my trip subsidized by my university. But I know you're here to see my friend and my interlocutor in conversation today, Reza Aslan, who, although he needs no introduction, I thought we would talk about him being an internationally acclaimed writer, journalist, documentarian, screenwriter. Not sure if there's anything else to add to the
raconteur.
Raconteur is always good.
Father. That's a big one.
Okay, that's a big one. Yeah, I didn't mention that one in mine, but okay, I'll pay for it when I get home.
Yeah.
But I'm sure many of you are familiar with his wonderful writings, going all the way back to really the seminal work of No God But God, including books like Zealot. And also, I must say, it's very rare that I get that giddy, and I suppose in Brit English, chuffed. But an American martyr in Persia, the epic life and tragic death of Howard Baskerville. Some of you may have actually attended Reza's talk yesterday about this. This is where real historians geek out, particularly because of the gap in the historical record. Reza has really contributed to that by writing this book, so I can't thank you enough to bring this very, very compelling individual who, on the one hand, you would think played such a minor role in the broader scheme of things, but was really actually so pivotal. Which brings us actually to the conversation to be had today of the notion of compelling figures in history. And Hussain ibn Ali, as the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, is exactly one of these figures, particularly in Islamic history. I'm sure that no Muslim is unaware of the story, and particularly the very tragic narrative of what happened to Hussain in the year 680 of the Common Era, which we will certainly get to. But then also exploring this idea of martyrdom, and especially how it then is deployed in other faiths, in other societies. What does it mean to be a martyr? Sometimes it has a very literal connotation, sometimes it has a metaphoric connotation. And particularly when we're looking at this through the lens of political activism. What are the lessons that we can learn from the story of Hussain? In Western literature, there are so many of these tragic heroes, people who are thrust into situations that were not of their making, but they have to do something about it because out of a sense of duty, out of a sense of obligation, and sometimes a sense of compulsion. Think of, for example, the figure of Hector in the Iliad. Here he is because
my favorite Iliad character, Hector. I love Hector.
Yeah. This is why sometimes you shouldn't have a younger brother, who gets into trouble, and then you have to try to bail him out, and sometimes you pay for it. But the fact that somebody like Reza still remembers him, his name has now been immortalized, if you will. And in many ways, I think we can say that about Hussain. So, Reza, take us back to the middle of the 7th century of the Common Era and Hussain.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's just such a delight to be here on this final day of this incredible festival. This is my first time in Bradford, not my first time in Yorkshire, but my first time in Bradford, and it's just been a wonderful time getting a chance to speak with so many of you and take part of these conversations and see old friends again. This is, as Saeed rightly says, is a pivotal story in the history of Islam, not just in Shiism, but in Islam. And so we thought that perhaps before we begin talking about what it means, what it signifies, how it's been understood throughout the centuries, what it means to us today, we should tell the story, just in case, make sure everybody's on the same page. And so, if you don't mind, I'm going to read just this very brief passage from my first book, No God But God, in which I distilled, there are, as you can imagine, countless narratives and traditions about the martyrdom of Hussain, and in the book I sort of distill them all into a single narrative. So if you'll excuse me, I'll just read that for you, and then we'll all know what we're talking about. Early in the morning, on the 10th day of the Islamic month of Muharram, in the 61st year of the Hijra, which would be October 10th, 680 CE, Hussain ibn Ali, grandson of the Prophet Muhammad and the de facto head of the Shi'atu Ali, steps out of his tent one last time to gaze across the vast, withered plain of Karbala at the massive Syrian army encircling his camp. These are the soldiers of the Umayyad Caliph Yazid I, dispatched from Damascus weeks ago with orders to intercept Hussain and his party before they can reach the city of Kufa, where a brewing rebellion awaits his arrival. For 10 days, the Syrian forces have besieged Hussain at Karbala. At first, they try to storm the camp in a stampede of cavalry. But having anticipated the assault, Hussain had pitched his tents near a chain of hills, protecting his rear. He then dug a semicircular trench around 3 sides of his camp, filled the trench with wood, and ignited it. Gathering his men in the center of this crescent of fire, Hussain ordered them to kneel in a tight formation with their lances pointing out, so that when the enemy horses neared, they would be forced by the flames to squeeze into the entrance of the trap. This simple strategy allowed Hussein's tiny force to repel the 30,000 soldiers of the Caliph for 6 long days. But on the 7th day, the Syrian army changed tactics. Rather than trying to storm the camp again, they shifted their lines to blockade the banks of the Euphrates, cutting off Hussein's supply of water. Now the time for fighting is over. Sitting high atop their armored horses, the Caliph's soldiers make no move toward Hussain. Their swords are sheathed, their bows slung over their shoulders. It has been 3 days since the canal stopped flowing into Hussein's camp. Those few who haven't already lost their lives in battle are now slowly, painfully dying of thirst. The ground is littered with bodies, including those of Hussein's 18-year-old son, Ali Akbar, and his 14-year-old nephew, Qasem, the son of his elder brother, Hassan. Of the 72 companions who were to march with Hussain from Medina to Kufa in order to raise an army against Yazid, only the women and a few children remain, along with one other man, Hussein's sole surviving son, Ali, though he lies near death inside the women's tent. All the others are buried where they fell, their bodies wrapped in shrouds, their heads pointing toward Mecca. The wind stirs their shallow graves, carrying the stench of rot across the flat plain. Alone, exhausted, and seriously wounded, Hussain collapses at the entrance to his tent. An arrow is lodged deep in his arm. A dart pierces his cheek. He is parched and dizzy from loss of blood. Wiping the sweat from his eyes, he lowers his head and tries to ignore the wails of the women in the adjoining tent. They have just buried his infant son, who was struck in the neck by an arrow after Hussein carried him up a hill to beg the Syrian troops for water. Their anguish penetrates him deeper than any arrow, but it also stiffens his resolve. There is now nothing left to do but finish the task for which he had set out from Medina. He must gather what strength he has left to lift himself off the ground. He must stand up and fight against the injustice and tyranny of the caliph, even if it means sacrificing his life, especially if it means sacrificing his life. Rising to his feet, he lifts his bloody hands to heaven and prays, "We are for God, and to God shall we return." A Quran in one hand and a sword in the other, Hussein mounts his steed and tugs the horse's head to face the barricade of soldiers standing only a few hundred meters in front of him. With a swift kick to the horse's ribs, he launches himself ferociously at the enemy, swinging his sword left and right, all the while shouting, "Do you see? Do you see how Fatima's son fights? Do you see how Ali's son fights? Do you see how the Banu Hashim fight, despite 3 days of hunger and thirst?" One by one, the Syrian riders perish by his sword until the great general, Shimr, orders the soldiers to regroup and surround Hussein from all sides. A swift blow from a lance knocks him off his horse. On the ground, he covers his head, writhing in pain as the horses trample his body. Hussein's sister Zainab rushes from the tent to come to his aid, but Hussein calls out to her to stay where she is. "Go back to the tent, sister," he shouts. "I am already undone." Finally, Shimr orders the Syrian cavalry to pull back. As his soldiers round up the survivors from the camp, the general dismounts his horse and stands over Hussein's racked and broken body. "Make your confession," Shimr says. "It is time to cut your throat." Hussein rolls over onto his back to face his executioner. "Forgive, O merciful Lord, the sins of my grandfather's people," he cries, "and grant me bountifully the key of the treasure of intercession." Before the prophet's grandson can finish his prayer, Shimr lifts his sword in the air and swings the blade down in one swift motion, cleanly severing Hussein's head from his body. He raises the head on a lance to bring back to Damascus, where he will present it on a golden tray as a gift to the Umayyad Caliph.
A pretty sobering, to say the least, description. And of course, there are some that tend to focus even more on the macabre.
Yeah.
And also, and thank you for your prose in writing that. Clearly, in hearing your account of this, there's a personal connection that you feel to the story of Hussein's martyrdom.
There is. Partly it has to do with the fact that as an Iranian, this story is in my blood. It's part of my national identity. It's part of my cultural identity. It's a story that I heard over and over again in multiple different forms. It is, to be perfectly frank, a story that helped form my very sense of self and how I understand who I am, my role in the world, my responsibility. And it's a story that I think most Iranians, if not most Shia, could say the same thing about.
So what kind of engagement then with the world does the story of Hussein create for you? If it is that sort of that clarion call that helps define your identity and your mission in life, how does it do that?
Well, there's this phrase that we use a lot, right? The footsteps of Hussein. We talk about this all the time. You walk in the footsteps of Hussein. And certainly that means different things to different people. But I think for me, it always meant that there is a burden that I'm supposed to carry, this responsibility that I have, that when faced with injustice or oppression, whether in the grand scale or whether even, at the playground, whatever the case may be, that I have a responsibility that is unshirkable, that I have to do something about it. I have to be Hussein. And that whatever the consequences of that action are irrelevant. That the consequences might be dire to my personal safety, whatever the case may be, but that there is this burden, and I keep using the term burden, and I really mean it in those terms. It's a thing that I would love to ignore, a thing that I'd love to shirk, but it's this overwhelming sense that I am being watched, that there is this example that was laid before me that I am aware of and that I can no longer ignore. And so that if I don't do it, if I don't follow in the footsteps of Hussein, then I have failed as a human being. And it's always been there. It's been there all my life.
So even from a young age then, you have the story of Hussein. Was this Hussein the religious figure? Was this Hussein the political activist?
That's a really good question, and it's almost impossible to distinguish between the two. Part of it has to do with sort of the historical context behind this story, right? Like most of these foundational religious stories, we tend to strip them of any kind of historical context. What we see is this heroic figure freely martyring himself, right? Knowing full well that his actions will lead to his death, and yet moving forward nonetheless, accepting that death in the full sense of the word sacrifice, right? That this notion that in dying, he is doing something, he's performing an action for the rest of us, right? But whatever else Hussein was, he was a historical person, he was a human being, he lived in a specific time and place. He made decisions based on the events that were, around him. And certainly the way in which his followers, his immediate followers, understood his actions had a much more to do with the way that we now interpret those actions than perhaps he himself did, right? Before I read this passage, I said, there are countless traditions. There are countless versions of this story. And when I went to go write them down, rather than sort of pick one, I just kind of blended them all together in a very deliberate way. But also with the understanding that, like our sacred scriptures and our great mythologies and our legends, going all the way back to Hector, that these are stories whose facts are not nearly as significant as the truths that they contain. And so, what is the truth of this story? And when you really strip it down, the truth of the story is pretty simple. When confronted with injustice, do you activate your faith to do something about it? Or do you ignore it and move on?
So there's this imperative in Islam, which I think some of you may be familiar with, the whole idea that if you see an injustice, you should go ahead and try to stop it with your hand. And if you're unable to do that, then with your tongue. And if you can't even do that, then you should at least oppose it in your heart, which is considered to be the weakest form of faith. But then there's also this, and I like the way that you put it when it comes to the notion of a sense of duty and even a burden, and what do you owe, and really to whom you owe it. There's the architecture in Islam that there's certain duties that you owe God. There's also certain duties you owe yourself. And there's certain duties that you owe the community. And you said this idea about Hussein doing it for us. So he was, of course, already, and as evident with the supplication, quite cognizant of his mission and obligation to, on a divine sense, and because it had meaning for him himself. But this idea about others, and being a martyr. That's quintessential to the story of Hussein, but it's also available in other religions as well. I mean, martyrdom, of course, is not exclusive to the story of Hussein, and certainly not to Islam.
Yeah, well, to your first point, I think there's something really important there, which is the historical facts of this story are, more or less clear that there is this belief within the early Islamic community, this sort of division that takes place over who should replace the Prophet Muhammad. And that decision fractures the community, which was very small, into two groups: those who believe that succession should remain within the Prophet's bloodline, and those who don't, who believe that bloodline is not important, that whoever is the best person for the job should be the successor to the Prophet. And those who believe that it should stay within the bloodline fundamentally lose the argument, right? They get Ali for a very, very brief time, but then there's a civil war and Ali is assassinated, and after that, it very quickly reverts back to those who believe that, well, it should just be the person most qualified for the job. But amongst this community, and the vast majority of those who, have you noticed I'm not calling them Shia yet, because they're not Shia. That term doesn't exist yet. There is a term that we use called Shiatu Ali, which just means that they are partisans of Ali. This is a political argument. It is not a religious argument. There is literally no difference whatsoever insofar as beliefs or practices between these two groups. There's just one argument, and the argument is who should be in charge. That's it. And among that sort of Shiatu Ali, the vast majority, as you rightly say, accept that this is an unjust situation, that, this sort of the caliphate has become this almost kingdom, if you will, that the caliph, there's this man named Muawiyah, okay, great, he's, whether he was deserving of the role or not, he's the strongest person for the role, very well, he's the next caliph. But then, before he dies, he makes his son successor, and this is weird for the Muslim community, because this is not supposed to be a king, right? This is not supposed to be something that you just inherit, that like your son, regardless of how, befitting he is of the role, just simply becomes...
Well, it was a very pre-Islamic notion.
It's a very pre-Islamic notion. It was one that they were adamantly against. It's not just like, well, it's Charles's turn, so I guess he's now the king.
Too soon.
I was sorry. That just didn't exist. And for the most part, most of the partisans of Ali saw this as unjust, but there was nothing that they could do about it. But what I think was phenomenal, and why this story continues to actually have power, is that Hussein, in seeing this injustice, said, well, it's my duty to do something about it. And he had an army of 70 people with him, which is absurd. An army of 70 people against what was at that time the most powerful military force in the world, the Syrian army. There was no winning this conflict. I think that's where you have to begin the story of Hussein, with the acknowledgement that there is no winning this thing. It's not possible. And yet he went. And I think, to me, that message is at the core of what we mean by martyrdom, right? This is a word, as you rightly say, that has taken on multiple connotations now. We use it in symbolic terms, where it's like, I'll be the martyr and I'll be the designated driver, as I was joking about earlier. Like that's your martyrdom. I won't drink tonight.
Or I cook and I clean.
Yes,
I'm a martyr.
I'm a martyr. But fundamentally, in its sacred sense, what it means is taking on a fight that you cannot win. So then the question is, who are you doing it for? And the answer is for the future, for
So
future generations.
So you can't win it in the obvious and visible present.
That's right.
But it has something beyond.
It has something, which is why I said it's for us, right? Did Hussein go into this fight because he thought he could change the situation that he was in? No, that would have been absurd. He went into this fight because he was sending a message, yes, to his people, but more importantly, a message to us.
So let's go ahead and compare this martyrdom to another one from sort of, if I dare call it, religious history, and that's the passion and the martyrdom of Jesus Christ. Was that a political act?
If you ask me, yes. I don't
I'm
want to
asking.
offend anyone, but yes.
I'm asking, okay.
I obviously have written a lot about this, about Jesus's crucifixion and what it means. And again, the same with Hussein. There are a lot of different ways to interpret this, and all of those ways are perfectly valid. But I'm a historian, and so what I am interested in is to strip these stories of their sacredness and talk about them in the real sense of what was happening here. And the most important thing to understand about crucifixion is that this was a punishment that Rome reserved exclusively for one crime. There was only one crime for which a person could be crucified under Roman law, and that crime is treason. And so this notion that, we always talk about Jesus, being crucified and the sort of the sacrifice that involved in that, etc., and what it means, and obviously it's taken on a whole host of different interpretations over the last 2,000 years. What can't be lost in any of that is that, according to the Romans, this was his punishment for treason against the state. That means that they believed that whatever else Jesus thought he was, whatever else his followers thought he was, that they believed that Jesus' goal was to overturn the occupation of Palestine, right, by the Roman authorities. And as a result of that crime, that the proper punishment was to be crucified as a traitor to the empire. So again, we come back to this notion. So if that's true, this is a war that Jesus cannot win. It's absurd. Again, we're talking about the greatest empire the world had ever known. An empire for which, Palestine and the Jews were just this sort of irrelevant clan, this superstitious, backward clan in some irrelevant backwater that served no purpose to the Roman Empire whatsoever. It's not where they got their grain. It's not where they got nothing out of it. It was just this little piece of land that they also happened to own. The notion that Jesus and his followers could overturn that was beyond the pale. And Jesus knew that. And yet, he went to this moment in which he accepted the punishment for his crime, treason against the empire, not because he thought it would overturn the Roman Empire, not because he thought that it would then give succor to his followers who would then overturn the Roman Empire, but because, like Hussein, he's speaking to us. He's giving a message to future generations. What do you do? What do you do when you are confronted with an impossible situation, an oppression and an injustice that is so great that it's irreversible, it's unmovable? What do? You fight to the death. That's what you do. You still go, you still try to overturn it, and you willingly martyr yourself in order to do it.
So when Jesus takes the action that he does, or allows himself to be subject to this, as far as you said, for us, there's this idea of redemption and salvation, particularly from a Christian standpoint of sin. The act may have been political, but the outcome was in a more theological framework. In the case of Hussain, there isn't, of course, the sense of redemption and salvation. But would it be fair to say that the mandate that is then leveled is really of political activism?
Yeah, I'm going to sort of change the question just a little bit, because it is true that the primary interpretation of Jesus' actions for the vast majority of Christians is that it was a redemptive sacrifice that cleansed humanity of its original sin and provided salvation for all peoples. It's also true that what I just said has no basis in Judaism whatsoever, at all. There's no such thing as original sin in Judaism. It doesn't exist. There is no such thing as redemptive death in Judaism. It doesn't exist. And the key to understanding who Jesus was is understanding that he was a Jew preaching Judaism to other Jews, and that this profoundly political act was very quickly defanged of all of its political significance and transformed, not by other Jews, but by Greeks, by Romans, into simply a spiritual act, right? An act that had no political significance to it whatsoever, just a redemptive act, one in which the rest of us can just simply accept by doing nothing, as Paul sort of famously says. Salvation is a gift. You don't have to do anything for it. All you have to do is accept Jesus's redemptive death, and you will be saved and you will live forever. Something very interesting happens at the end of Karbala too. So a few months after Hussein's death, when power is once again restored and any hint of rebellion is diminished, a group of Hussein's followers who did not fight with him travel from Kufa to Karbala. And when they get to Karbala, they begin this sort of process of ritual lamentation, right? They beat themselves, they cover themselves in dirt, they weep and they cry. They basically are saying, you know, had we been there, we would have died too. Again, there is no tradition of lamentation in Islam at this point. It does not exist. And so they begin this kind of process whereby they take this political act, deeply political act, and they spiritualize it, right? They remove the political significance of it because there's nothing to be done about the caliphate. It is what it is. But you can take part in that act, stripping it of its significance, fully spiritualizing it. And indeed, it's that moment in which what we now refer to as Shia Islam is born.
But there's a universal message of Hussein that transcends Shiism. And we see this sort of more broadly in the Islamicate or the Muslim world.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is how that message has also then been internalized by others who may have had a tryst with political activism. So, quote, "I learned from Hussein how to be wronged and be a winner. I learned from Hussein how to attain victory while being oppressed." Any guesses on who said that? And Boris Johnson is a wrong answer. I'm sorry? Nelson Mandela?
Close.
Very close. It was Gandhi. Yeah. Since, we turn to you for a follow-up answer. Yes, but yeah, it's Gandhi. But the fact that you are looking at that particular pantheon is quite telling. And here you have a rather devout Hindu who sees in Hussain a message that resonates in such a difficult ordeal as the independence movement of India. But you also then see that in the internalization by a mid-20s evangelical Christian who graduates from Princeton University, and that's Howard Baskerville. How does he then, I should say, maybe let me invert my own question, since you already did one, I get one too. How did Hussain reach Howard Baskerville?
It's an amazing story, and one that I kind of uncovered by accident. So just to back up a little bit, Howard Baskerville...
And you don't need to tell them the whole story, let them get the book.
That's right, yes. Well, I'll give you the cliff notes. Howard Baskerville was a 22-year-old Christian missionary, an evangelical Christian missionary, who in 1907 went to what was then known as Persia in order to teach English and to preach the gospel, but who showed up in the middle of this revolution, it's called the Constitutional Revolution, and who, after a very long ordeal, a 2-year ordeal, eventually abandoned his missionary post, gave up his teaching position, eventually gives up his American citizenship, and joins the revolution in order to free Iran from the tyranny of the Shah, and then dies this kind of very heroic death. And he is, in Iran, to this day, given the label of Shaheed, a 22-year-old evangelical Christian missionary who is called Shaheed, or martyr, in Iran. And as I was trying to uncover the sort of the last days of his life, so this is after he had already joined the revolution, but before he died, I found this diary entry from one of the missionaries' daughters, a 15-year-old daughter named Sarah Wright. And it was this story about how about a month or 2 months before Baskerville died, they all together, the entire American missionary community, decided for the first time to go and watch the Tazieh. And the Tazieh, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is the sort of annual reenactment. It's the passion play in which the actors reenact the martyrdom of Hussain. And so, if it's okay, I'll just read that section to you if you happen to have it.
I thought this would be really good, just because it parallels so nicely your description.
Right.
Of Hussain.
Well, let me, if I may, can I read the scene in which he watches the Tazieh? Would that be all right?
Dude, it's your book.
It's like, read whatever I want to. You know what? I think I have it here. Hold on. Let me find it real quick.
The fact that
but you hold on to this.
The fact that you can't go straight to the page.
It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing. So it's February 1909. The revolutionaries are, ironically, under siege. They have been besieged by the Shah's soldiers. There's been no water, no food. So the parallels to 680 are pretty intense. And in the midst of this, it happens to be, Muharram, and so it's time for the annual Passion Play. So there's this sort of strange
parallel
meta, it's like this meta experience where you're watching this play and you're actually living it as well. So I'll just read this I'll just read in the middle of this. It was easy for Baskerville to tell the characters apart, the actors on this, by the color of their costumes and the way they delivered their lines. There's Hussain, resplendent in green, the color of paradise, a stark white shawl draped over his shoulders to symbolize the sacrifice he's about to make. And there, riding up on his horse, is the Syrian general Shimr, dressed in red, the color of violence, 2 long crimson feathers jutting out of his helmet. The Tazieh script is written in verse. Hussain and his companions sing their lines in lilting voices, in tune with the traditional melody being played by the accompanying musicians. The villains, in contrast, shriek their lines. Their voices are sharp and discordant, their movements heavy and offbeat, as though they are in conflict, not just with the music and rhythm, but with the very nature of things. The Tabriz production was a simple affair, nothing like the sumptuous performance being staged in Tehran's Royal Theatre at that same moment. There were no set decorations, just a bowl of water on one edge of the stage and a bowl of fruit on the other. The Syrian soldiers carried bronze swords and shields, dulled and dented by years of performance. Young boys dressed in veils played the female roles. It was common practice to portray the heroes and villains of the Tzieh as contemporary figures, and indeed that is still a common practice. Baskerville may have noticed that the actor portraying Hussain bore an unmistakable resemblance to Sattar Khan, who was the head of the Revolutionary Army. He had the same greased-back hair and elegantly waxed mustache as the people's commander. The actor playing the villainous caliph was short and fat and looked for all intents and purposes like a farcical Muhammad Ali Shah, the Shah that was the tyrant at the time. At the end of the play, Hussein's companions are scattered across the stage, prostrate and still. The bowl of water has been knocked over, symbolizing the cutting off of water to the camp. The bowl of fruit is stomped by a Syrian's boot. Hussain is alone. His white shawl is splattered with fake blood. He circles the stage slowly, staring into the face of every spectator. He has a message for those with the wisdom to hear it. You can live under oppression, or you can die with dignity. Hussein's choice is clear. What is yours? We are for God, he intones, and to God we shall return. The audience wails and beats their chests, crying out, Hussain, Hussain! Afterward, when the stage had been cleared and the crowd dispersed, Baskerville could still see audience members huddled together here and there, their eyes bleary, their chests heaving. They held each other and wept for Hussain, as though they had all been there with him at Karbala, as though he had just died. It was not an unfamiliar feeling. Howard Baskerville has sat through many passion plays depicting the death of Jesus Christ. He may have even starred in some as a child. He knew why the audience wept with such ferocity. He did not need to stretch his mind to consider Hussein's final question. It is the question all Christians must ask themselves. Had he been there at Gethsemane when they came to take his Lord? Had he been forced to watch as Jesus was tortured and nailed to a cross? What would he have done? Would he have run away and hidden himself? Or would he have been that disciple in Gethsemane, the one who drew his sword, the one who was ready to defend the Lord with his life? What was it Jesus had said just before they dragged him away? Greater love has no one than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. Baskerville must have read those words more times than he could remember. He had based his life on them. One can argue that the entirety of the Christian religion rests upon that one verse and the absurd challenge it poses to believers, that they should be ready to forfeit their lives, not for gold or silver or any riches of this world, not suddenly or in response to some unexpected danger, but deliberately and with forethought as an act of faith so that others may live. Isn't that what he'd been taught ever since he was a boy, fidgeting in a pew in one of those old box churches where his father preached? That the highest reach of love is the sacrifice of the self. And this is the moment where Baskerville turns, where he makes that sort of final decision that he is going to give his life to this revolution that's not his, to free a country that's not his, to save a people that he doesn't have anything in common with other than his humanity.
But it's an injustice.
But it's an injustice.
And that seems to them...
And it's that moment of seeing Hussain, this play depicting Hussain, and the sudden realization that I know this. I know this story. I felt these emotions. I know what the message here is. I've heard it before. I get it. That makes him realize, oh, there's no difference between me and the Persian next to me, right? That we are the same, We have different religions, we call God by different names, but that idea that any suffering anywhere in the world, right? The suffering of one person anywhere in the world is the responsibility of all peoples everywhere in the world. That's what binds us together.
And it's what brings the very stated call that every place is Karbala, every time is Ashura.
That's right.
With that, I'd like to open it up for questions. We have a roving microphone, so please make yourself visible to us. I can't imagine there's no question. We can keep going, but yes, sir. Thank you for showing the kind of courage that we're talking about here.
Hussain!
Not at all. Thank you for a very enlightening account. What do you think it tells us about the short-termism that we see in our economic, our commercial, and our political lives nowadays?
Well, I do think that you have a point in the sense that so much of the way that we get through each day is by focusing on the here and now, focusing on the present moment, get past this moment, get past this moment. But I do think that there is this other message here, right? That the sacrifice, whether it's Jesus' sacrifice on the cross or Hussein's sacrifice at Karbala, was not a message in the immediate. It was a message for the future. It was a decision, it was a step that was made whose consequences and whose legacy was designed for the centuries, for millennia in both of these cases. And I know I've tried hard, I don't always succeed, but I've tried hard to, when confronted with certain moments, certain decisions, and I've had these moments before, where I'm confronted with something and something has to be said. I don't know, I'm beating around the bush. I'll just mention the particular moment that I'm talking about here. I used to have a very lucrative, very successful television show on CNN. And then when the horrible tragedy happened here in 2017 on the Thames, when a madman began running over people, then President Trump, even before you were dishing out the dead bodies from the river, tweeted out that this is why America needs a Muslim ban. And I tweeted out, you are a piece of shit. And my career ended at that moment. The show was canceled. My speaking gigs were canceled. I had 24-hour security that would have to follow me to my classrooms where I taught, that would have to be outside of my door. My children were given death threats. Basically, the whole structure that I had spent so much time constructing collapsed at that moment. And many, 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 many times I have been asked, do you regret that? And I regret the consequences of it, but it goes back to where we began this conversation. I saw something that had to be confronted, and I knew that I could just ignore it and survive that moment, or I could do something about it and create something that would last, that other people might think about. And I chose the latter and dealt with the consequences.
Excellent. Okay. Yes, up here. Oh, we can wait for the mic. That way everyone else can hear the question that you have as well.
Very interesting. one of the things I wanted to ask about was that within the Islam of all the sects that are there, why is that Hussein and his story is never discussed, or even if you try to discuss it, they shut you down? What is the reason behind it?
The question is about, within all the many, many different sects and schisms of Islam, how come it's often the case that, Hussein is not really a figure that is discussed, or as you say, when he is discussed, it's shut down? Well, because it carries so much political weight now, right? There's so much that has been attached to this story, right? 1,400 years of infighting and schisms and divisions, that it becomes now almost impossible to say the name Hussein without bringing up all of that baggage. And so you're right, people just don't. Or if they do, it's always in the most anodyne way. It's always a very, as stripped of its implications as possible. And again, I understand that.
If I may, one of the things that I see is that in the discussions and the debates to which I'm privy between Sunni and Shi'i, particularly in Detroit, which has sizable communities of both, there was a resentment among not just a few of the Shi'i community that why don't Sunnis venerate Hussein in the same way that they do? And some Sunnis actually do venerate, but just not in the same register and with the same emotion and passion and structure, if you will, that occurs in the Shi'i community. And then what happens is when sometimes Sunnis do get into that veneration, the rejoinder is, you're coming in on our turf. Hussein is ours. And part of that is the notion of Hussein being a very central feature within Shi'ism. He certainly doesn't enjoy that centrality, I would argue, within Sunnism. So part of it is, I would argue, that we're at that time now that, who wants to claim it? And it's not just from the standpoint of selfishness or proprietary interest. This isn't Hussein Incorporated or Hussein Limited, but the idea of preservation of the sanctity of that. You look at it from a standpoint of a different religion. Look at yoga now. Now you have Christian yoga, goat yoga, all of these different kinds of things. And there's a huge debate going on within the Hindu community that can we ever bring yoga back to its actually very theological origins? The idea that it has become secularized. And in America in particular, yoga has now become fashionable, having the Lululemon pants and the right kind of yoga mats and all of this. So the idea of preservation, I think, plays a very big role in that. We have a question, this young lady there.
Hi, thank you very much. I've got two interrelated questions, really. So firstly, just following on, I find when we talk about Imam Hussein, it's a very emotional, very spiritual, very spiritual context. But I found you kind of stripped all the emotions out, and you presented it in a very factual-based way, and obviously, explain the political context behind that. How do we bring that back in again? Because I think when you talk about in a spiritual context, you lose the kind of moral, ethical, dimensions behind it, and I think that's something that we need to perhaps bring back into either Sunni or even, Shia thought. Secondly, given the UK context at the moment, where we've got all these laws about how to stop political activism and how to limit this, where do you see this going? Do you have any comments or thoughts about how we're taking that forward in the UK?
I don't know if I'm the right person to talk about UK politics, at least not until I'm heading towards Heathrow.
No, I think it's after you've left Heathrow.
Yeah, right. On the tarmac, then I have lots to say.
Well, actually, I think you're flying BA, so maybe when you get to LAX.
Wait till I land in LA, yeah. To To your first part, if I can understand you correctly, you're saying that when we strip it of its spiritual dimension,
And emotional too.
we lose the emotions. I completely understand what you're saying and don't disagree with it. One of the things that I said very early on in my statements was that I want to strip it of its spiritual connotations for a moment because A, I'm a historian. B, I think that there is enormous value in trying to kind of dig through all of the various spiritual significances that have been layered upon the great religious leaders of our world, the great prophets of our world. Because, as I said earlier, no matter what you think of these people, no matter the esteem that you hold them in, they were just human beings. They were people living in a specific time and place, influenced by that time and place. That you may think that they are, that the words that they spoke are eternal, everlasting words, but they were actually words that they spoke to certain people in front of them. And that to truly understand who they were, what they meant, you do need to understand all of that context. That's what I do for a living, is focus on that context as a way of understanding who these incredible people were. But I don't deny that Jesus and Muhammad and Ali and the Buddha and all of these, incredibly important religious figures have had these layers and layers and layers of spiritual interpretation, that they mean different things to different people in different parts of the world. And that in many ways is why they're important, is that they have survived, in our interpretations.
I mean,
But that's not my focus.
So I'll try to go ahead and really briefly do this so we can get one more question. On the second question, having both British and American nationality, I would just say don't vote Tory. But on the first question that you have, if emotion is evidence of devotion, and I'm not trying to rhyme here, by the way, if emotion is the evidence of devotion, then the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And if I may not necessarily be outwardly emotive, but that's just my nature. And as a result of it, it shouldn't necessarily be misconstrued as a disrespectful deficiency in how I might feel about Hussain. And I think that is a very legitimate, certainly, critique, particularly coming from within the Shi'i community, about seeing Sunnis as relatively quietist on this. But I don't think that necessarily means, it's not a binary, that somehow the other they endorsed what happened to Hussain at Karbala. Right. Last question to
we have time
Mohammed.
for just one very, very quick last question.
I can never do anything quick. Linking to the conversation we were having yesterday on Islamophobia, the challenge we as British Muslims in the UK have, that we have terms like shaheed, martyrdom, jihad. They've been hijacked, particularly by right-wing populists, and also on one hand, and also those from within the nutcases in our own communities using mainstream terminologies to advance their own extremism, etc. as well. So I just wanted your thoughts on that, and how do we navigate this very tricky issue of language and how it's used?
Yeah, this is a very long answer, but I'll just say it in the shortest way possible because we're out of time, which is take it back. Own the terms. Take it back. We were just talking about this. You had that incredible panel that you're doing with Bukra.
Kubra Gumashay on language.
Yeah, on language and the use of language. And we were having this whole discussion about words that when I was a kid were slurs or, had these sort of throwaway meanings that we would use all the time, that now just a generation later have been completely transformed by the marginalized community just simply taking it back. This is our word now. It belongs to us. We're going to redefine it. There's no reason why words like jihad, words like shaheed, you're absolutely right, that we can't take those words back, that we can't make them what they truly mean. And I think that, you know, as we start to do it, just as happened with so many other words, it'll shift in the mainstream as well. And other people will start to recognize these words for having the deeper, more profound meaning that, you know, they've had throughout the centuries.
And think about it, I mean, as we were saying before, that if one of the ways to confront and oppose injustice is by the tongue, how better a way to do that than to reclaim the terminology that comes from the tongue in opposing that kind of injustice. Thank you so much for your participation in this session, sharing with our conversation. Thank you, Reza Aslan. Please join me in expressing our gratitude.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the festival, please subscribe, share this episode with others, and leave a rating. Don't forget to mark your calendars as the Bradford Literature Festival returns for its 10th year from 28th of June to the 7th of July 2024.